And we're ready to go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Future of London Learning from Crisis webinar. I'm Lisa Taylor. I am Executive Director of Future of London and Director of Coherent Cities. I know a lot of you in the audience, and I'm delighted that you could be with us because I know you'll do something with what you hear today. So thank you for making the time. This Learning from Crisis program is really true to Future of London's USP in that it is about cross-sector solutions, about cross-sector actions. That's public, private, voluntary, academic. Now everybody's involved in this effort. It's also about diversity in approach and representation. We think both are critical. And it's also about hearing not just from top tier leaders, which is great, but also from operational and next wave leaders. We have an alumnus with us today. David Eastwood was on our Leaders Plus program. He is leading the rough sleeping effort within the GLA. This is part of a three-part series on local economic recovery. Today is about immediate response and about vulnerable populations. We'll be hearing about councils to do with residents, small business, and charities. We'll be hearing about rough sleep, and we'll be hearing about the creative industries, which are not just sort of trustafarians and Hackney Wick, if you're going to go that way. It's about a huge sector that has a lot of vulnerable people whose side gigs are also gone. So we need to take that very seriously also. The three parts are this one, as I say, on immediate response. The next one is longer term recovery in July. And the third one is about how do you pay for public projects. That's one that we ran live in autumn and winter of this year. That was backed by Montague Evans. And they're with us backing this program again today. One of their economists is with us who'll speak at the next session. So welcome. This will run smooth as silk, just like your session. So it'll be great. And again, just coming back to today's session and speakers, if you are tweeting, we are at Future of LDN. The hashtag is Learning from Crisis. And if you remember, capitalize the L, the F, and the C. That makes it easier for text readers to pick up for the visually impaired. We will be sharing the slides with you. We will be sharing an edited version of Q&A with you and any other bits and pieces of a write-up on the website afterwards. That's futureoflondon.org.uk. We very much encourage you to use the Q&A. It's at the bottom of your screen. Ask questions either during the sessions or in the Q&A, but also please share what you're seeing, what you're doing yourselves, because we want this to be a really productive and practical session. I think that's mostly it for me. I'm going to introduce Nabil in a second. He is leading, well, he's Director of Enterprise Jobs and Skills at Lambeth. He led a session for us for the Leaders Plus group and was very eloquent about how you manage and lead through a crisis like this when it hits you. He's going to go a bit more broadly today to talk about what happens when you're actually running it. How are they planning for the next wave if that happens, and what are they looking at longer term? So he's going to kick us off. Each speaker will go for about 10 minutes. We'll do a short bridge in between. And then we'll come back to you with a poll and a Q&A. So we'll be with you for about an hour, and I'm now going to hand over to Nabil Khan. Nabil, over to you, and your slides will come up in a second.
Thanks, Lisa. Hello all. As Lisa said, under normal times, I'm the Director of Enterprise Jobs and Skills at Lambeth. But during the emergency response, like many of you, I'm sure, my role changed slightly and I was tasked with leading the council's economic response to COVID. Before I go on, let me just start by giving you a helicopter view of the council's response to the pandemic. I mean, Lambeth focused on three initial areas initially. The first was around resident support. So that was about getting homeless people into accommodation, offering council tax relief, and emergency cash support for those that had to wait for universal credit. The second theme was around voluntary and community sector, and that was around setting up our food and care packages hubs, distribution hubs in the main. And the final theme was around local economy, which is what I'm here to talk to you about today. I mean, each of those areas, I should say, by the way, were given agency by our chief exec and the leader of our council. We were told to move fast, break things if necessary, iterate and adapt quickly. I mean, the key message was a sense of urgency. So we had to work across directorates, we had to work at speed, and we had to work in partnership with our businesses and our BCS sector. And I think it's fair to say, in general, local government became the fourth emergency service during those early months. And collectively, we really stepped up to the plate and showed that locally sourced solutions truly are the most effective solutions in an emergency. So I'm just going to take you through a few things that we did on the economic front. Ollie, can we go to the next slide, please? I won't dwell on these slides. These slides will be circulated, as Lisa said. So for those that are interested, you can have a look. But what I thought I would highlight is that the north of the borough, the north of Lambeth, is really our economic heartland. It's our biggest employment cluster, as is to be expected. It's the central activity zone, and it's where the majority of our businesses, both large and small, are based. So just some context there. Next slide, please, Holly. So, I mean, the first thing that we did on the sort of economic front was that we're fortunate in Lambeth that we have 7 business improvement districts with reasonable coverage across our business space, and they know their patches far better than I do, and my team does. So the first thing we did was form a business task force where we brought all 7 of those together because we knew they would want a voice in whatever our response efforts were. And I'd hope that if you spoke to any of them today, they would say that was a really positive experience for them because they genuinely contributed to our sort of collective response efforts. So once we had formed the business task force, we identified a number of things that we had to put in place fairly quickly. The first of which was making a decision very quickly on applying 3 months rent relief for all our tenants occupying any of our buildings or land. So that was about 320 odd businesses that benefited directly from immediate rent relief. And that was important for us to do because a lot of the things that our councillors and myself and others in my team were saying to our partners were, look, we need to be flexible in terms of the sort of the rent collection that we're expecting from our tenants. So we had to lead by example, and had we not done that ourselves, it would have made it far more difficult for us to sort of encourage our landlords and others to sort of take a similar approach. We also froze commercial waste charges for our pubs, bars, restaurants. We thought it was unfair that given that they were in lockdown, that they would continue to pay this service charge to us. So that was a fairly instant decision we took. I suppose the biggest thing we did was we accelerated the sort of disbursement of the government grants, so on the retail, hospitality, leisure grants and the small business grants, and we really set up a team to sort of help our business rates team and just get that money out of the door into the bank accounts of businesses ASAP. I just received a phone call there, apologies. The other thing that we did fairly quickly was set up a dedicated business and resident helpline. So this was separate from our normal council helplines. This was a dedicated business one where people or businesses could phone us and get access to support that either we were offering ourselves or signpost them to the various government initiatives that were announced in that sort of early period of April. So I think that worked really well in just providing that single point of contact in the council. And similarly on the resident front, we set up a separate focused helpline for our vulnerable users who again could just get through to us as quickly as they could. And then we conducted a business survey so that we went out to our businesses. We wanted to find out what was happening in real time on the ground. And frankly, the information we were getting from national data sources just wasn't quick enough. So we had to get a bit more local intelligence. And the final thing we did sort of immediately was a rapid employment support. So we knew those that were becoming unemployed for the first time, we had to get support to them ASAP because the Job Centre Plus and EWP hadn't quite geared up at that point to deal with the sheer volume of numbers coming their way. Next slide, please, Ollie. And all of these activities were done at speed and made a real difference to businesses and residents and our voluntary sector. But behind the scenes, probably the most important thing that we were doing was gathering local intelligence. I mean, I mentioned there the sort of business survey. We got responses back who from a sort of cross section of our sector base who told us exactly what the impact was on the ground. We were using a lot of high frequency fast data, as we call it. So in the absence of national official statistics, we started using things like footfall numbers, recruitment website search data, as opposed to official DWP data, transactions data from sort of credit card companies, just to get a better sense of what was happening on our high streets, in our town centres, in our sort of employment clusters. We also used some in-house high frequency data. So we had our trading standards team out there, we had our public protection team patrolling. They were giving us real-time insight into what was happening on the ground. And all of this was brought together in a sort of in a in-house data hub, really, and then cross-referenced with the sort of official statistics as and when they started to sort of come out, which is really important in that although the initial response was mainly about what we can do immediately, we were fairly clear that we had to set up quite quickly what our recovery efforts were going to be. And all of this data, all of this insight, all of this intelligence helped inform what is going to be the next phase of our response, i.e. our recovery. Next slide, please, Ollie. Thank you. And that sort of leading on from that, really, the data and the insight that we gathered told us, for example, that we were expecting roughly about 20,000 people being unemployed in Lambeth. It told us that nearly a fifth of our residents may have been furloughed at the time. And then when the official data came out in early June, it just confirmed that for us. So it meant that we were 6 weeks ahead of the trend on that front, and we could start to draw up packages of additional supports. And one of the things we did was set up a local economy hardship fund with a real focus on 4 areas. The first focus being on independent leisure, hospitality, and nighttime economy businesses, because these businesses didn't get support through the initial measures that government introduced because of the rather arbitrary rateable value threshold that the government had set. So we were keen to support them. They're a big part of Lambert's economy. It makes large parts of Lambert what it is today, vibrant, creative, etc. So we were keen to sort of support them specifically. Next slide, please, Ollie. And the other sort of sector that suffered quite a fair bit was the arts and culture sector. So we set up a arts and culture risk fund, giving grants of between 10 and 25K to, again, organisations that hadn't been able to benefit from direct government schemes. Next slide, please. And similarly, the other sort of gaps that we had noticed were around charities, shared workspaces, and market traders. So again, our local economy hardship fund, the one that we set up, was very specifically targeting these organisations. And there are some numbers there that you can see. 145 charities benefited from our grants. We're currently working our way through shared workspaces in Lambeth, and we've already given 10K each to 69 eligible organisations, and we're continuing to do more. And market traders, really important point, really, they're vital to supporting the local economy. You know, they often sort of create active public spaces. They make a significant contribution to an area's vibrancy. Just take Brixton, for example. So, you know, we were really sort of keen to sort of support them as well. Next slide, please, Ollie. So what next? Sorry, next slide, Ollie. I mean, I think, so that was the immediate response. We've been gathering intelligence data, what have you. I think we were also keen to learn from what happened in 2008 and 9 in particular. I know it's not the same. I know it's a different kind of recession. I know this is more akin to the Great Depression, but in our lifetime, that was something that sort of happened fairly recently. There was a lot of literature out there about what happened post 2008-9. So we were sort of keen to learn from that. And this is something that I've adapted from the Audit Commission, by the way, reports post 2008-9 recession. And what's interesting about this is it sort of highlights the 3 waves of the economic impact that we can expect, really. So the first one we're at currently, job losses, business closures, reduced incomes, reduced demand, etc., etc. The second wave is when it starts to have implications for social. So, you know, we know it's going to lead to increased mental health issues, increased domestic violence, rising crime, rising level of NEETs. We know this happened in 2009. We can expect this to happen again. And the final wave is probably the most important one. We are still dealing with the sort of long-term implications of the 2008-9 recession on our residents to this day. They are some of our furthest from the labour market residents. We're still dealing with that today. And what this recession is going to do is just further exacerbate the inequalities that already exist. So we can expect something similar this time around as well. I've written there, but this time will be different because this is not like the recession that we faced in 2008-9. This is more like a global depression. Next slide, please, Ollie. So what do we do? We sort of, well, we plan, and we plan some more. So behind the scenes, we're doing some modelling. What would it look like if this was a one-time outbreak with a severe economic impact? What does that mean for our services? What does that mean for our residents? We do some modelling. We sort of build our services accordingly. What does it mean if there are recurring outbreaks? So if we get a second spike, if we get a third spike, like the Spanish flu in 1918, what does that mean for our services and our residents and the resources that we have? So we're doing some of this planning behind the scenes. Next slide, please, Ollie. But I think it's fair to say that no scenario looks particularly promising. So what we've done here is according to those 4 scenarios that we're playing with, we've tried to model what the job losses numbers may look like. And as you can see, there is a sort of peak immediately in all 4 scenarios, which we're going to have to deal with this summer, this autumn, and then depending on the sort of number of outbreaks we may face, that will have a different impact on the sort of number of job losses and business closures we can expect. So we have to plan for the worst and hope for the best is my sort of summary on this. Next slide, please, Ollie. And I suppose just to finish off, talking about the plan for the worst and hope for the best, the only thing that we can be confident about is what we need to do immediately in the next 3 months. I think the medium term and long term plans that we're putting in place, we have to be agile. We have to be ready to pivot if the economic outlook changes in a couple of months. So what we've done here is we have put together what we think our sort of focus areas should be on particularly the business work stream. And we've got something similar on our places. We've got something similar on our people front as well. But on our business front, this sort of short-term actions that we can be fairly sure of is we need to reopen our high street safely in the coming weeks. They already are. We need to develop sort of the northern part of Lambert's area reopening action plan and get people visiting again, the cultural organisations we've got up there. And then finally, on a more local level, we have to administer the local economy hardship fund to help our businesses survive the lockdown before they can start thinking about how they adapt their models and thrive in the recovery period. And I'll stop there.
Oh, thanks, Nabil. A whirlwind, but a lot of good information there and a lot of questions probably from people at other councils kind of saying, can we have this? Where do we get that? There was a question about how did you fund the grant? So I think the Q&A will be quite rich in terms of what you can offer. Thanks. We're going to go next to David Eastwood, who is head of rough sleeping at the GLA, to find out how they've managed to get so many people accommodated so quickly, but also perhaps more importantly at this point, what comes next. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Lisa. So I'm David Eastwood. I am the rough sleeping lead over at the GLA. So in normal times, my team deal with the Mayor's response in relation to rough sleeping and Commissioner Pan London's services. Ollie, is it possible to go to the next slide, please? So I was thinking back in terms of to the start of March, and which now seems like almost a lifetime ago, but actually isn't that far ago. And the meeting that I had with the Secretary of State and Dame Louise Casey, just as she'd come in to help central government with their response, where we presented to them the proposal looking at trying to house as many rough sleepers and also those people rough sleeping in communal accommodation into hotel spaces. We had a plan that was trying to do this, and what we were looking at was not only those that are currently sleeping on the streets, but also, as I mentioned, those people in assessment centres and rough sleeping in shelters, rough sleeping in communal shelters. We were very concerned about as to how this could potentially spread the disease very quickly amongst what is a very vulnerable population. So I was pleased that we managed to convince the Secretary of State and Dame Louise in terms of around what our plans looked like. But we were very clear in terms of those conversations we were having with them that we couldn't do this on our own. We were going to all need to club together. I was meeting with her with the voluntary sector. We need the voluntary sector. We need all the boroughs. If you know, rough sleeping services are kind of a patchwork quilt and myriad of different funding streams and different delivery partners. So we needed to make sure that we were all together in terms of on this journey. And as Lisa mentioned, this part of it in many ways, now looking back, was actually the easier part, but it was still pretty difficult. So Ollie, if you go to the next slide, I can say a little bit more. So why did we think we needed this dedicated response for rough sleepers? We know that rough sleepers age prematurely. If you're looking at the kind of average life expectancy of a rough sleeper is shorter. We know that if you're looking at their actual kind of respiratory symptoms, that is highly definite. I mean, their health is at a lower level. There's a high level of mental health and substance misuse. Also physical health, and also we know in terms of that rough sleepers frequently use emergency services. So we knew that we need a partnership response in terms of around this. We saw this as a huge opportunity also to try and get some people who had been resistant to services, who had not been coming in to service, who had historically stayed away from commissioned services, to try and get those people in. We also knew that within our hostel accommodation that we have, there were going to be some buildings that weren't suitable in terms of for self-isolation. So as well as those kind of communal winter shelters that I talked about and the assessment centres, that we knew we had to get everyone from that accommodation into self-contained accommodation. Then we knew there would also be possibilities that we would need to look at different approaches in hostels and different approaches in other accommodation as well. And we also knew there would be challenges in terms of around ensuring that people did effectively self-isolate. Apologies, there's my phone. I should put that on to mute. I will do that now. But we knew there would be difficulties in terms of around ensuring compliance with this guidance. Can we go to the next slide, please? So where are we now? This is a picture of where we were yesterday. So we've got 14 hotels in the GLA stock. We've got 1,251 people currently residing in those hotels. As you can see there, if you know, in terms of where those hotels are based, we had to do lots of work with the boroughs in terms of around that. We took in around 900 people from winter night shelters and communal sleeping areas. The rest were then referrals from street outreach. We looked, if you go to the next slide, please, Ollie. We separated out in terms of our accommodation in terms of cohorts. So we had one site that was COVID care. So this was, we worked very closely in partnership with the Find and Treat team from UCLH, who could provide the kind of medical care from that. They worked with Médecins Sans Frontières to get Médecins Sans Frontières volunteers in to assist in terms of around the medicine and around that side and the health side of things. So we had one hotel that was specifically set up for anyone who was displaying symptoms, so we could immediately take people out of the other hotels and put them into that COVID care facility. We could also take referrals from hostels and from the streets. So that was to try and ensure that if there was a positive case in a hostel where there might well be some element of shared facilities, we could immediately hopefully go test that individual, get that individual out of that what could have been a difficult and a spreading accommodation into somewhere separate. We then had 3 hotels that were COVID Protect, that were focused on those people that either needed shielding or their other kind of physical health needs meant that they were a greater risk in terms of around COVID. And then we had 10 hotels that were COVID Prevent, where we took people that, it says there, were neither displaying symptoms nor were vulnerable, but we knew it was a risk in terms of them either being on the streets or in shared assessment centres. If we can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of how we did this, like I said, we worked in partnership with some wonderful voluntary sector organisations. So we had 5 different providers providing support. So we've got some Mungos, Thames Reach, SHP, which is Single Homelessness Project, Look Ahead and DePaul, who provided staff from existing services and begged and stole and provided and encouraged people who had just recently left the sector to come back to the sector to help provide 24-hour support in all of the hotels. So we're providing that level of support alongside the hotel managers and support staff. And I have to say, the hotels, we moved so quickly. Some of those hotels were amazing in terms of around the deals they were up for doing, in terms of around the flexibility they were able to give us in terms of around working in what for them obviously is a very different client group to they're normally used to. So we've got travel lodges, we've got holiday inns, we've got a whole variety of different hotels across London, but where they're working, in the hotel, normal staff working alongside our providers to provide that support in terms of anyone in there. We also, as I mentioned, pulled in the wider support from volunteers. Crisis volunteers came in. We've got volunteers working from a number of other organisations. We pulled in health colleagues, so everyone who came in to any of our accommodation was given a health check. We worked with Green Light, who provided health checks for people. Everyone had a health check before they came in, so we could look at trying to ensure that people would get the right support once they were in there. We also set up the first ever Pan-London substance misuse service. There was food, there's laundry, all these things are crazy. If we go to the next slide, I'm conscious of time. So that was kind of the first stage of it, getting everyone into the hotels. The next stage, which as I mentioned is probably the more difficult side of things, is then working out what everyone can move on to. So we're working with the providers, and we have a kind of red, amber and green system of where we think people are able to move on to. We think there are quite high numbers. It says there about 600 people who we think we can move into the private rented sector with a small level of support, so floating support to then go on. Within about 200 people who are going to need clearinghouse, so they need that more intensive tenancy sustainment, and then about 150 and 200 who we think will need supported accommodation in a borough. We have a very difficult and a challenge of, because we took so many people from the winter night shelters, we took in a huge number of people who have got potentially no recourse to public funds or very complex immigration cases who normally local boroughs and ourselves couldn't fund in accommodation, but because of this public health emergency we were able to take them into accommodation. Resolving those cases and working out what people are eligible for is going to take a lot of work with colleagues from the legal sector and colleagues from the Home Office to try and work out how we can ensure that anyone who has status keeps that status, and we can ensure we can house them effectively. So this move on work, this move on plan is extremely difficult and yet complex, kind of Tetris amount of moving people around. We're looking at interim accommodation now as well as hotel accommodation to move people into, but we need to make sure we're moving the right people into the right place in terms of around potential permanency. Could you move to the next slide, please, Ollie? So yes, as you can see, there are all these areas of work streams in terms of around accommodation. So we've got the private rented sector, we've got modular, we've got leasing, we've got hostels, seaside and country homes, detox reconnection. So there's all these areas of work that we're looking at in terms of how we can move on. And one thing I think that we're increasingly nervous of and looking further ahead is around, obviously we're in the warm weather now, which is also has some concerns for in terms of people on the streets, but the cold weather and the cold weather shelters that would normally operate, that's voluntary sector and the faith-based community would normally do, obviously are not going to be something that's possible in terms of around COVID. A facility that moves around 6 different churches providing a floor space for individuals is not something we can look at in terms of moving forward. So we're really nervous about how exactly it's going to work with a potential second spike, all of that side of things. So there's a lot for us to plan and think about in terms of moving further forward. And I think I've just about run out of time, so I will leave it there, but obviously very happy to take any questions around this later on. Thank you.
Thanks, David. A lot going on with you. I think that question about what happens next is key, and what if we do a second site? That's what the poll will be about when we get into Q&A, so we'll come to that as well. We're going to close with Ada Esposito, who runs Creative Thinking. She is currently also co-lead of the Tottenham Creative Enterprise Zone, and has an alarming but also very interesting view on what's happening with the creative sector. So Ada, over to you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. So together with my colleague Philippine Nayin, I am responsible for Tottenham's Creative Enterprise Zone. For those of you who aren't aware, the Mayor of London officially launched the Creative Enterprise Zones in December of 2018, and it was a scheme specifically to support and protect the creatives in our capital. The other Creative Enterprise Zones across London, so my fellow colleagues in Croydon, in Hounslow, in Lewisham, and Lambeth, and of course our direct neighbours in Hackney Wycombe and Fresh Island, fly forward to March 2020, and this notion of protecting and supporting our creatives takes on a completely different guise, where we were looking at expansion, where we were looking at growth and cementing those roles and those opportunities for all Londoners to participate. Immediately became a question of survival, in effect. Ollie, if you could go to the first slide, please. Thank you so much. So I just want to get the devastating facts out the door really quickly, because it's really easy for us to dwell on how horrendous these figures are. Most of you may have seen the headline warnings, the latest report from the Creative Industries Federation and the Oxford Economics team came out last Thursday afternoon and really told most of us what we knew and felt on the ground, that the creative industries is absolutely suffering at the moment, much more so than other industries and other sectors. You can see again from the statistics that are in front of you, and for those of you who are interested or working in the sector, I highly recommend the report. It's incredibly telling, incredibly so. It's worth saying that before this, the creative sector was growing at 5 times that of the wider economy. So you can completely understand why the creative enterprise zones were established and why the Mayor was so keen to be supporting that direction of travel and opening up of the offer for creatives right across London. Next slide, please, Ollie. I don't want to dwell on the negative. And the reason for that, and most of you will know, is that the creative sector is also incredibly resilient. And I think for me, this slide, it kind of says it all. You'll be pleased to know it's one of only 2 slides that I'm using today, so you don't have to worry about any of those. I really wanted to talk about the resilience of the sector and what we can do in real terms to support them both now and into the future. So the creative sector, as many of you will know again, were amongst the first to pivot. They went digital. They created opportunities for virtual assembly. They created programs and offerings. They put online their archive of materials. Many others pivoted absolutely what they did, using their skill, their facilities and their equipment to support the wider societal needs. I'm immensely proud of Fashion Enter, who are a Tottenham-based organisation who completely turned their operations and their staff around to making PPE kit that was much needed at the time of the very beginnings of lockdown. We know many other creative organisations did very similar things right across fields, from fashion right through to 3D technologies, etc. I have to say that in Haringey, the situation was quite acute and very different. It's really easy for us to talk about the creative sector as a monolithic whole, but of course there's so much nuance and detail that is different for every borough, for every neighbourhood, for every area. We're talking about really large scale national institutions right through to very small businesses of 1 or 2 employees, or freelancers indeed. In Haringey, almost 1 in 4 businesses belong to the creative sector. That's staggering if you think back to the statistics released by the Creative Industries Federation around the impact on jobs and the impact on businesses alone. We know that almost 1 in 5 residents in Haringey are employed within the creative sector. That's slightly higher than the London average of 1 in 6. So the opportunity there for risk to job losses, to unemployment and need was absolutely immense. So what did we do? We worked really quickly. We had a strategy, a kind of 3-pronged strategic approach. The first was an absolute emergency response to what was coming down the line, and we knew from neighbours in other countries what lockdown was going to look like, who would be hardest hit. For us, it was incredibly important that we understood the impact locally, and we also had channels open ready to speak to as many people as possible. It's interesting, sometimes the creative sector are known and celebrated for being very much under the radar as part of what gives some of them their edge. This particular instance meant we needed to know. Being under the radar was not a good place to be. So my colleague Philippine is absolutely brilliant at harnessing the immense wealth of data on social media to ensure that we had a much better, clearer understanding of who was operating in our borough, what the needs were, what the issues were, and how we could connect with them really quickly. So our 2-pronged emergency response was really about offering one-to-one support. It was really about just communicating as often as possible, daily if necessary, the opportunities that were out there, the problems that we foresaw, who they could speak to, whether it was us, whether it was someone else, whether it was licensing, or indeed whether it was a funding body who had come up to support that particular sector or subsector. Really, I can't stress to you the importance of having communication on a regular basis, and for businesses to know that there is someone or two, 3, 4 people that they can go to as soon as they need help. Sometimes it's just knowing that someone knows and cares that you're there. Doubly true of our creative sector, I would say. Our lists, our Instagram account and our email bulletins went out and have quite rapid sign up, and we now feel we have a real sense of who we're speaking to and what their needs are. We followed up with a creative industry sector specific survey, so we could absolutely analyse, together with the rest of our economic development team, what the needs were, what the most pressing issues were, not just in London, but actually on our patch in Tottenham within the Creative Enterprise Zone, and more broadly right across Haringey. And again, that information was really vital to stage 3 of our 3-pronged approach, which I'll speak about in a second. Our second phase of work was really about the kind of nuanced and more considered response. So after the immediate impact of knowing that an artist was not going to have a gallery show anytime in the next 6 months, possibly a year, that theatre productions were not going to go ahead, that people who were employed in set design and fashion shoots, photography work, were just not going to get work. What became really important to us was actually our partnerships. So my fellow colleagues across the CEZ areas of London, we all harnessed our collective knowledge and energy and expertise. We reconciled what was common amongst each of our areas, and we sought where possible to develop programs or to suggest stimulation, which would most impact as many of our creatives as possible. Hackney Wick and Fish Island, together with Loughborough University and ACCO, came up with a brilliant scheme for placing furloughed workers with specific areas of expertise like fundraising, accounting, marketing, website design, together with smaller creative businesses who maybe were struggling in those areas. So a real positive use of everyone's time, an opportunity to volunteer some skills and expertise, but also a mandatory, necessary helpline to many of our creatives who are really struggling to be able to pivot their business or to help support themselves through the crises. We looked to other partners to see who might be able to offer a different type of work. Again, Fashion Enter delivering so much PPE kit that was incredibly necessary, but helped that business stay afloat for quite a period of time. And then we went to the third phase, which I'm kind of loosely calling survival. And by that, what we really mean is sustainability, in effect. It's what does this look like? We know it's not a blip. We are looking at a second spike down the line. But how do we sustainably support our businesses to get through this period, through the potential recession period, and come out the other end? So we still have them both in Tottenham, in Haringey, but also in London, when we are all ready to go back to the cinema and the theatre and the music venues that we know and love and cherish. For us, that was really clear what we needed to do. We needed to offer, wherever possible, paid work. A lot of our creatives in Haringey are, whilst they account for 1 in 5 employment opportunities, and they account for 25% of all business, are mostly SMEs and micro SMEs. We are talking about very, very low numbers of operators. We are talking about lots of self-employed. We are talking about lots of freelancers. We are talking about a lot of sole traders. Really difficult for them to both just deal with the daily impact of COVID on society, let alone on their business themselves. So we looked at our economic recovery plans, and again, together with our fabulous economic development team, we created an overarching economic recovery plan for the whole of the borough and overlaid that with a creative economy recovery plan. And what we noticed actually was about 75% of all of the interventions could, should, and hopefully will have some sort of creative input. So where we need support, where we need to look at our high streets, where we need to look at opening up roads and footpaths to allow for social distancing, where we need to do all of those, quite frankly, infrastructural investments, there is a creative element that can be explored. There is a talent that we can use that comes from our creative sector. And that's what we've set out to do. So we've set out to engage local practitioners in all of those interventions where practical and realistic in terms of the timescales of delivery and in terms of the health and safety implications, et cetera, et cetera. We are directly commissioning our creative partners to deliver work on our behalf. We are hopefully before the end of the summer opening an open air art gallery along our high street, showcasing our creative work. And we are talking to colleagues and again partners, including private sector development investment partners, about the opportunity of opening up those high street spaces that may become redundant to our creative partners possibly instead of for rent, for social value agreements in place. So we are animating the high street, we are bringing life and vigour to the high street and to our local communities, but we are also supporting creatives in order to deliver their own work. The final part of that phase is actually doing what we can to help our creatives use their nous to get through this. We don't have all the answers, and actually we are not always the market player as the local authority, but we need to be nimble and able to appropriately respond. And by doing that, we try to catch as many people as we can. I'm happy to talk more about some of those opportunities as part of the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Ada, much appreciated. Really good point. And I'd be interested to find out later whether any council anywhere you think could take on the overlay of creative and economic recovery. So we'll get into that in Q&A. Thank you to all three of our speakers. We're going to go to Q&A in a second. If you have questions for them, you can put them in the Q&A box. We want to kick this off, though, with a poll. I think all of you in the audience are hearing the fact that we're talking about a potential second wave or second spike. You're seeing that happen around the world, and we're not maybe addressing it necessarily. So we want to ask you what you think about these three aspects in terms of council, small business and charity, rough sleeping and creative industry. Are we ready for a second wave, and can we survive that? So Ollie, if you could please put up the poll question. We'll give you about 60 seconds to go through this. Take your time. There's sort of a between answer on all of them. We're starting to see the answers come in. This is interesting. Some will manage, some will fail is a fairly standard one on local businesses. We'll share the answers with you when we're all done. Can we keep rough sleepers off the sleep? Depends on no eviction. These are quite complex questions, so we realize there might be a If you want to ask us questions or ask the speakers questions about some of the nuance in these things after the fact, go ahead. I think we've still got a few people coming in, and we'll give it another 5 seconds for you guys to respond. We've got about 70% of you have voted at this point, and I think we're going to end it now. So Ollie, if you can end poll and then share the results, please. Excellent. Okay, so this first one, will businesses and charities survive another perhaps shorter lockdown? Some will manage, some will fail is a fairly go-to answer. We were hoping this could be on a spectrum between yes, we're getting good at this, and no, it will decimate the industries, but this makes some sense. We'll go to Nabil on that in a second. Homelessness and rough sleeping, the question was really, we've learned what needs to be done. Some optimism there, depends on government, and then no, homelessness will flourish. Quite close there between actions and their implications and what may happen naturally in terms of people going back on the street. And then cultural industries depends on the overheads. I'm going to stop sharing my poll now. We had a podcast with Barbara Brownlee at Westminster, and she was talking about the fact that you can change pavement use, you can make people feel safer in terms of being on the street in a borough, but you can't change the seating layout in a listed theater. So she, in that podcast, it was really good, it was Tony Travers, and her was talking about being basically heartbroken about what's happening to the cultural industries. But I want to ask you, we've got questions coming in, reactions to that poll in terms of local businesses and charities surviving. Nabil, I'll go to you on that. What's your feeling about that?
I think what the audience has said is right. I think I would agree. Some will fail, some will not. We're seeing that already, I'm afraid. I know locally there's been some closures in Lambeth. I mean, it harks back to our hardship fund. One of the reasons we set that up was because we knew 2 months ago that given the sort of uncertainty of lockdown was sort of bringing, and given the uncertainty of how lockdown release was going to work, we knew some businesses would struggle. So we've got a fairly good sense of some of the sectors that are most impacted, and it's needless to say, it's the hospitality, it's retail, it's leisure. Unfortunately for us in Lambeth, they tend to employ a fair number of people. So I think there's a double whammy here. One is the sort of businesses closing, but then the knock-on implications it has on job losses. And unfortunately, when you actually analyse who those jobs are held by, I'm afraid we're starting to see a real sort of gendered and age sort of impact on those losses. So we know young women in particular have been really badly hit in Lambeth because they tend to make up a disproportionate number of sort of the workforce of the retail and hospitality sector. We know European workers as well, again, because of hospitality workers. We know men over 50 because of the construction sector and the sort of slowdown there. And particularly our black residents. Our black residents have been hit really hard because of the transport and the transport sector, which they tend to disproportionately represent as well. So we know businesses are closing already. We know the sort of subsequent impact on job losses is going to be fairly substantial. We're going to see mass unemployment like we haven't seen since the early 1980s. We know this is going to happen. So I think what we can do collectively, this includes local government, national government, charities, and other players in this, is respond collectively. And the hardship fund was one element of that. I noticed the question in the Q&A about how we were able to fund those businesses that weren't included in the sort of in a definition of that the government released. It was surprising actually, the discretionary fund that the government released. So our take of that was 2.9 million, and for something that was promising local discretion, it came with a fair few strings actually. So we decided early on that we were going to use our neighbourhood community infrastructure levy to top up that fund, make it 4.2, and that allowed us the flexibility to support businesses with a rateable value of over 51k. And it's a really important point for London actually. It was a rather arbitrary rateable value that was set, and I know a lot of other London boroughs have been struggling to support their businesses with a rateable value over 51k. So what the NSIL allowed us to do was to support those businesses, and actually some of our sort of cultural institutions, some of our long established pubs, clubs, bars, they wouldn't have qualified under the government scheme. So we're actually using our top up fund to help them, which is helping a little. But I'm not going to lie. I don't think it's going to stem the bleeding to the extent that we'd like it to.
Thanks, Nabil. I'm going to go to the next question. It's a very good Q&A coming in, so we're going to roll through the poll fairly quickly. David, your response to the homelessness and rough sleeping answers, people, a lot of depends, but also this question about hotels needing their rooms back. How long can you extend these deals for?
I'm less worried about the hotels. So we've had some really positive conversations in terms of with some hoteliers recently in terms of around extending hotels. And we're also looking at kind of interim accommodation, whether that's university accommodation or YHA or various other options. So I'm less concerned about the people that we've got in. What I'm more concerned about is the people that are coming to the streets. And as Nabil mentioned, this recession that's coming, we're already seeing people who had tied accommodation linked to their jobs in the hospitality sector coming to the streets. We're seeing, and that's without the private rented sector and the kind of default and those evictions that we kind of feel is being stored up. Government are doing the right thing at this stage in terms of around saying private sector renters cannot be evicted, but that is storing up a problem that I think we feel is going to be coming. So I'm less concerned with people that are in the hotel accommodation. I think we've got, we're trying to do plans in terms of around those. It's that potential flow of new people to the streets and how we ensure that what we're doing is actually going to work. And like I say, because especially if we can't look at communal sleeping, that, in the winter time provides a huge number of beds. There's about 800 beds that are provided by the faith-based community for rough sleepers in communal sleeping areas. Without that, we're going to, we are storing up something, and I think we're going to need to, as Bill said, we need to work across the board into how exactly we're going to try and resolve this. So I think, I think the poll is right, but I'm less concerned about the hotels. It's more the new flow to the streets.
Thanks. David, there are a lot of somewhat technical questions that I think we want to get into with people afterwards because they're quite specific advice. But Ada, one thing that struck me about this poll about the cultural industries, it made me a bit sad, saying the small, loved and mutually supported organizations, which is kind of what you're talking about. People don't feel they have the best chance of survival. Well, what can you say to that?
It very much is a mixed bag, really. Unfortunately, there's no one quick answer. One of the problems we know that the very large organisations, our national institutions, our national theatres and so forth are very good at vocalising the issues, the fundamental issues for all. some of the smaller organisations are less able to do that. And again, it's incredibly important that organisations like the Creative Industries Federation are there to champion and speak for all. And in many instances, those large organisations are preparing the territory for everyone else to be able to follow. So unfortunately, there's no quick solution that anyone can find. What we are finding with the smaller organisations, where they're less likely to own the premises they're in, are subject to the same issues that my colleagues are talking about for other sectors. When those eviction blockage notices come to an end, where the rates relief come to an end, the true impact will be felt. And we have kind of a story of two halves. We have some brilliant landlords, including local authorities where it's appropriate, who are able to and are thinking about the extension of deferral of rates or deferral of leases. But that is not true of everyone. Both public and private sector are struggling in all areas. And for a lot of those smaller organisations, they will be make or break days where they have to start paying full rent and just don't have any income, because what we've told them to do for so long, which is diversify their income streams, we've told them to open cafes and bars and restaurants, in addition to the plays they're putting on, in addition to the comedy, in addition to the live music. All of those were stopped at once. So all of those multiple avenues for income generation were stopped in one heartbeat. And that is difficult for anyone to get over. So I think that's why you're seeing the mixed response from everyone, is that there's no clear solution, and we need the large nationals to keep campaigning, but we also do practically need to get behind our very small and local organisations and make sure we're buying from them and doing what we can to support them.
Thanks for that. I think there is something about what can we do as organizations, but also as individuals. Supporting local businesses is obviously key. Sometimes that might mean paying a bit more, or getting something you don't necessarily need, which is against all the things we've been taught as being sustainable. But if it's about sustaining small business, let's keep that going. As I say, there's stuff about social value agreements and leases that I think we want to get into with people who need that in detail afterwards. For now, a good question, because we probably will have a second kind of spike, but things come up. What one thing, and I'll ask this to each of you in turn, would you do differently in terms of how you responded, that, you know, if we have to go again, that you might learn from and do again? Nabil, I'll go back to you. Maybe not one thing, but what's the one that comes to mind?
I was sorry to sort of try to skirt this question. I mean, I was really impressed with the way we locally responded, actually, in sort of getting all our ducks in a row, in how collaborative everyone was. So it's difficult. I think it's too soon still to sort of reflect back and think, what could we have done differently? Because I'll be honest, I still feel, and certainly my team still feel, that we're still in the middle of the response. So whilst we're sort of, you know, planning for recovery, and we're thinking about what the next step will be, we are still in the middle of a response here, and you know, other colleagues have sort of mentioned exactly why. So it's difficult to be reflective when you're still in the middle of a crisis. But I suppose communication is the first thing that springs to mind. I think one thing I've learnt is those of us that were in the thick of it from day dot. So it's, you know, from when lockdown was announced, we have remained in the thick of it throughout the period, because that's just the way it sort of worked out. If you were there involved in the day-to-day stuff, you've sort of remained involved. And I think there are other colleagues across the council and across the borough, in our case, where if they weren't involved in the sort of in the nitty-gritty stuff, you know, from the offset, it's about bringing them in now, and it's about the system change that we want to sort of act as a catalyst for, really. So I think that's probably if I was being hypercritical, I would say in the early stages, the really sort of tight command and control structures we had in place were great, because it meant we could respond on the public health front, it meant we could respond on the economic front, and it meant we could get things done. But now, as we want to move towards a distributed leadership across the system, communication, I think I would, if I had my time again, I probably would have communicated even more than we did in the early weeks.
Gotcha. We heard from Hannah Jameson, is it, at Lambeth as well, talking about that system thinking too. So we know you're working on it now. David, your thoughts, anything you would have gone, okay, if we could do, well, you may have to do it again. What might you do differently?
I mean, I think the main thing, and I echo Nabil's thoughts, I think we are still in the midst of it, so it's difficult. I think probably thinking about that move on before we got people in. So obviously, if you know what I mean, there was such a thing about let's get everyone in, let's work out, let's do this, and everyone worked over and above. And I think one thing that I'm really keen that we keep going is that partnership work. And like you say, is that let's not worry about the paperwork. In some ways, let's not worry about the paperwork. Let's just do what's best, and then we can sort the rest out afterwards. And being able to do that, and that keeping that as we move forward is something I'm really keen to do. But yeah, that kind of working out how we were going to monitor people, what exactly we were thinking of, having that headspace to be able to think about that early on is something that I think we would definitely look at changing and look at kind of building on. Also, if I could clone my team, that would be good. So if there's time in the next few, next month or so to be able to clone them all, that would be, and all the partners we work with, that would be amazing. Because yeah, I think the hours everyone worked, especially from my side, weekends, all of that, is amazing. But you can't keep up that pace. And I think the Bill's right, is how do you start bringing in other people from the wider organisation to help with that, who weren't there at the start, but can then help them keep things going. Because I'm nervous that we're all running at such pace that you end up in the thing that people are going to fall over if they're not careful.
Actually, Ada, I was going to make a not a joke, but just saying there are people in the creative industries who are looking for work, but frankly, who are close to this vulnerable area. And there may be some people who have transferable skills. I mean, maybe, you two should have a chat as well. Ada, what your thoughts about any one thing you think you might do differently as we go again?
I'm going to be cheeky and say two. We know in the creative ecology that we have a fragility to the way we work. So there's lots of people on short-term contracts. There's lots of people who aren't in full-time employment with the benefits and wraparound package. That is an issue that we should be trying where we can as a local authority to lead the change on that. And that needs to change, because I think part of the reason our creative sector has suffered so terribly during this pandemic is because of their vulnerable employment status. It's not allowed them to access certain funds. It's made them vulnerable in terms of sick leave and holiday, et cetera, et cetera. The other one is, quite honestly, I would probably get on the phone and speak to as many creative businesses as I possibly could from day one. There are as many as we reach, there are twice as many that we didn't know about. And because we didn't know about them, we didn't know that they needed help. And the time it took us to find out that they needed help, that made the difference. And doing my time again, first day, I would have just called every single person that anyone recommended to me and asked proactively if they needed some support.
Thanks. I think there's so many, I'm going to ask you, committing on screen, can we, with some of these more technical questions, ask you perhaps for signposting help between you guys, talking about groups? Certainly some stuff in there about social value agreements. Maybe we've got a bit of time. Do you want to just hit on that briefly here for a general audience, Ada? Yeah, of course. So actually, Nabil posted something fabulous on LinkedIn. I suggest and recommend people go look at his post around the old Vic statements around what is being talked about in the theatre world as a cultural infrastructure plus type scheme, which suggests to the government that they invest, very real terms, invest in the creative sector, invest in theatres, and then the return on investment is a percentage of surplus that those spaces may make, but also the social value return of what our cultural and creative organisations already do. The social value agreements are a small scale version of that. So it is looking at the very real value that creative enterprise brings to an area and to people in terms of health and well-being, in terms of longevity, in terms of skills and employment opportunities, and quantifying the value of that and using that as a measure to offset other costs. In this case, it could be business rates, and as a CZ collective, we are looking at maybe offering, or the opportunity and the viability of offering business rates relief to creatives, but it could look at percentage off rent for what you give back to the community as a creative business, and looking at the model over the long term to see actually whether the long-term value is far greater than that rent or that business rate that you would have brought in. Well, that actually takes us to the kind of next question, which is perhaps for Nabil or you, working with landlords and developers, how amenable are they to helping? There was a question here, Nabil, you may have seen about long-term negative impact on shared workspace because the business rates don't support them and so forth. Some very interesting things happening, a lot of vacant space. What are you seeing and what are you hearing from landlords?
So, I mean, the landlord question is really, really interesting actually, because as you can imagine, again, one of the first things we did was we reached out to other public sector landlords in Lambeth. So we worked with TfL, we worked with Network Rail, Arch Company, and ourselves as well. So we wanted to establish between us what was our sort of coverage, I suppose, of the borough, and it was quite remarkable to find out actually between us how many business tenants or commercial tenants that we had. And that was part of the reason why we wanted to go first with a 3-month rent relief and really go to Network Rail and go to Archco and others and say, look, we're doing this, can you do this? And let's align where we can. Because what we don't want is, let's take Brixton, for example, where we're a tenant, we're offering 3-month rent relief, but the tenants next door, because it's an Archco owned sort of premise, they're not being offered 3-month rent relief. And actually, we were really positively surprised by just how collaborative TfL, Network Rail and Archco were with us in offering that. And you would have noticed that all of those agencies came out fairly quickly and said that they're going to be offering 3-month rent relief as well. So that was great. That was us as a sort of collective public sector being able to say, this is what we're doing for our businesses on our patch. And then that allowed us to have conversations with our investors and our developers and say, okay, look, this is what we're doing. Can you do something? And I'll be honest, all the developers that I've spoken to throughout these 3 months, they've been ultra helpful in trying to find solutions to this. And they've been, they've not always been able to offer 3-month rent relief, but they have been able to offer flexibility. And you've got to remember, they've got their own pressures in that they've got their sort of lenders to satisfy. So where they've been able to offer, they perhaps haven't gone for the blanket approach that we did, because we can absorb some of those costs, perhaps. But they have been flexible in their response. So I think we as a council were quite pleased with how our landlords worked with us. And just very quickly on that shared workspace front, it's interesting. So for us, we've identified this as one of our medium-term objectives in looking at what it could mean for the future of workspace in general. And I think if we're looking at a future whereby we're seeing fewer visitors into central London and more visitors staying local to their outer London town centres, it could well be that in our case, for example, we need to up the sort of volume of shared workspace that's available in Streatham as opposed to Brixton or Waterloo or Vauxhall, for example. So those are the sorts of things that we're looking at now. Actually, if people are going to stay a bit closer to home, people are still going to want to go out and socialise. We're social animals. They're still going to want to sort of interact and what have you. It might just be done in more local centres rather than everyone rushing into the centre. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for shared workspaces in future. It might actually be a better thing for our local economies, generally speaking.
Thanks for that. I'm watching the time. It's 1:31, but that was really worthwhile. And Barbara Brownlee will argue with you. We must go into central London. It's going to be tug of war now from local and central, but I want to make sure we let everyone go on time. Please do check futureoflondon.org.uk for the follow-up to this, because we'll share these guys' slides, plus any signposting we can share. There were really good questions. We've noted them all down, and we'll address as many as we can afterwards, and you'll have time to read them and look things up as links. Thank you very much to all of our speakers, Ada, Nabil, and David. Thanks also to Ollie and Sophie in the background, helping out, making sure it all ran smoothly, and the gods of internet. We sacrificed a goat earlier. It's all fine. We hope you do take stuff away from this and that you have a great afternoon. The series continues in July, as I say, with a longer term view of what happens with local economic recovery and then how we pay for public projects. Again, thanks to Montague Evans for supporting this series as part of Learning from Crisis, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks very much.